Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a quick review of Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is an author that I've been wanting to read for quite a while but just never really got around to. And to be honest, I was kind of a bit put off actually because I'd heard a lot of people talk about the male gaze in his books, but I decided to buddy read it with one of my Patreons and it was quite an interesting experience. This is not going to be super long, but I just wanted to give my thoughts because I think some of you who watch my channel do tend to, read outside of fantasy and sci-fi. And I think some of you have also been getting into Japanese translated fiction as well, which is always great. So overall, I think my experience of this book was very lukewarm. We're following our main character as he's basically going through life and he's experiencing different facets of life. There's a lot of thematic exploration around like love and death and perception of women and how that perception of women shifts as men get older. There's some really interesting insight into Japan at this point in time, which was set in 1960s Tokyo, which was a period of time where there was a lot of global unrest and there was a lot of student protest happening at that time in Japan. So we're following Toru Watanabe as he's going through school and he's trying to figure out who he is in the context of this broader world. And it's a lot of exploration around his relationships, not only with women, but also the men in his life and also kind of family members in his life as well. There's a particular focus on two relationships that we get. I'm not going to specify which characters because I don't want to potentially spoil it for anybody, but there is a particular focus on two relationships that really shape who he is at that moment in time, like when he's experienced those relationships, but also as he kind of gets older and he matures. One of the things that I really loved about this book is the writing. I can say very confidently that Murakami is a very, very talented writer. It's very, very well written. This book feels extremely nostalgic, and I felt nostalgic for a period of history that I know very little about. I almost felt like I wanted to go to 1960s Tokyo because of the way that he writes about the city and the people in the city, and it feels like something that is very familiar to me, even though I am not a Japanese student in 1960s Tokyo. He's able to make the world feel relatable, even though that world is very distant from my own reality. It almost felt like I was shown a version of Japan that like we just don't really hear much about. And I think that's partly because of the time period, but also because this is a story that is about the people in the city and not necessarily the city itself. So we're seeing the city through people who are actually living there and experiencing it live, not necessarily through like a tourist perception on Instagram, right? Like, it's very interesting to see this city through the realm of somebody who knows it very intimately. And it almost felt like a love letter to Tokyo, and it almost felt like a love letter to Japan. And it made me want, I've been wanting to travel there for a long time, but it made me want to travel there even more because I was seeing a version of Japan that we just don't hear about. And yes, I'm well aware that this is 1960s Tokyo and Tokyo is very different today, but there are certain things that he talks about that just made me feel very nostalgic for this period of history that I would like to go and experience parts of when I do eventually go there. So it was a really interesting experience for me. It felt very visual. It almost felt very cinematic as I was reading the book. And I was really thankful to Murakami for painting this picture of Japan that I think a lot of us are probably very unaware of. I really like the characters in this book because I think each character really kind of talks about a different theme. Our main character, Watanabe, is just a young boy who's very immature and doesn't really know much about life. And we're seeing this world and his relationships through the lens of his eyes, right? And so naturally, we are going to be witness to the male gaze. I'm going to come onto the male gaze in a second. But one of the things that I really liked about Watanabe is I think even though he's a young man who is, perhaps looking at the world differently to me as a young woman, I still found aspects of his personality to be quite relatable when I was in school and when I was at that age, even though it was a different period and a different place. Like, again, I think Murakami is able to make this world and these characters feel very relatable in a way that I've not seen many other Japanese authors do, which I think in itself, he has to be commended for that. About the male gaze, now, one of the most common pieces of criticism I heard about Murakami is that his treatment of women in his books is very much like for the men who are reading this book, right? And I have read many books like that. It's not something that I particularly enjoy reading. It's not something that I particularly like being witness to, if I'm being completely honest. I think there was a time where I was more open to it because it opened up my mind to how maybe men think about certain things. But now that I've read enough of that, I don't really care about it. That being said, I didn't actually mind Watanabe's perception of the women in this book because I think from just my own experience, like I think his perception of women as a young boy going into adulthood is actually probably quite relatable for a lot of men. I don't necessarily think we should hold that in a negative way because I do think a lot of men can probably relate to what Watanabe was going through in high school and how he perceived women. What I didn't like is the constant sex. I really didn't enjoy it. I'm pretty indifferent to it being in the books that I read now, but I think it has to serve a purpose and it has to add something to the book and not just being there for the pleasure of the reader. And I have to say, I did feel like it was in there just to attract a certain type of typically male reader. And I think it was there to appease the male reader rather than it actually adding anything to the conversation about relationships. So whilst I don't necessarily mind reading a character and seeing the male gaze through that character, what I don't like is when sex is being used as a mechanism to appease the male reader. Like I just don't enjoy it. I felt like it was a forced mechanism for like the male reader to get pleasure from it. I don't know. Like I just didn't enjoy it. And Mandy, who I buddy read it with, also felt the same way. I just want to say I'm not against it being in the books that I read, but it has to serve a role. In this, I don't feel like it did. One of the things that I did really like though is the exploration around. Now, it's really interesting in Western society. They're very taboo topics. And for that exact reason, I am going to bleep out the words that I have said because I don't want to get demonetized. But it's really interesting how like it's such a like taboo subject in at least in the UK and the US. Like if you talk about these things, people will look at you in a very negative way. It's interesting because I feel like in Japan and some other East Asian cultures, it's almost like an accepted part of life and there's a lot of like shame attached to it. But what's interesting is that I think a lot of the shame that is attached to it is also because people don't like talking about it, which is a contradiction in their society, I think, which I find quite fascinating. So it's accepted, but it's also seen as shameful. Whereas, you know, in the UK or the US, it's just like not talked about and it's not necessarily seen as shameful, but I think a lot of people see it through like a lens of sadness, right? Like I feel like there's a contradiction here and a bit of hypocrisy here that I find quite interesting. And I really liked Watanabe's reflection on death as well, and that it's something to be accepted and that it's a part of life. I think it's quite a liberating view of death. And again, I think that's a view that probably a lot of people have, but for some reason we just don't talk about it in a lot of Western cultures, which is interesting in itself. Overall, I liked what this book was trying to do, but I'm just very lukewarm on it. Like, I think the execution in certain regards was really good. Like the vibe and the atmosphere that Murakami creates, I think is really beautiful and gives insight into a part of the world that I in particular didn't really know much about, especially in that period of time. But I really found it to be challenged to read in places for some of the reasons that I gave before. I did love the themes around like trauma and death and suicide, as they're very human, right? Every person, regardless of culture, will go through those things in some regard, especially trauma and death, right? What I didn't like is the fact that that trauma just manifested into our character objectifying women, and I just don't like that. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. So overall, I gave this book a 3 stars, so like very much in the middle. I don't think it's a bad book, but I wouldn't say it's a book that like changed my life or like made me think about things in a new way or in a different way. I just think there's certain things he does really well, but there's other things that I think I, as a female reader did not enjoy. I'm really keen to read more of his books, and I will definitely be reading more of his books because I do think he's a very talented writer. And so overall, you know, that's kind of why I'm very lukewarm on this book. I'm really curious to hear if you've read this book and, you know, what your perspective on it is, because like I said, I'm very lukewarm on it. I think there's some really great things about it, but I also think there's some not so great things about it. And I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts. So let me know down below in the comments and we'll have a conversation there, I'm sure. Thanks for watching, folks. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and I will see you in my next one. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you very soon.